First of all, thank you for coming. So let's see. Chicago Best Ideas was started at our 100th anniversary. And the idea was and remains like somebody should talk about one of the great ideas that came out of our law school or our university sometimes. And then do a current take on it. Like, what do you make of this idea now? Has time made the idea look better or worse? How do you apply the idea to what we do in the law school or in the curriculum or in your lives or whatever? So each time, I at least have stuck to this original notion. So each time we pick an idea and I explain the idea, though it's usually an idea that people have heard already. And then we run with the idea a little bit. And the idea of the idea is that you should have a little bit of skepticism. Like, really? Could that really be one of our best ideas? I don't know. But it works. And then over the course of things, hopefully you'll go to all the CBI series talks. And I think that over 3 years, people have seen, between 10 and 15 of these best ideas. And then they really know a lot, both about the history of ideas, the history of the law school, and how the ideas play in their own lives. So here I go with this year's first CBI. And I'll tell you the idea, though you probably read it in one of the advertisements. And then I'll talk about the idea a little bit. Okay, so one of many of Chicago's best ideas came from our own Richard Posner. And one of his most discussed ideas is this idea that the common law is efficient. And I want to explain what that means, and I don't want to just tie it to the common law. So I'm going to talk about both the common law efficiency and the efficiency of law in general. Like, is it plausible? When does it seem like law is efficient? Efficient meaning in this case, not purely economic efficiency, but meaning, just to rattle you a little bit, that you can be sure that law is better now than it was 50 years ago. Like, oh, law is efficient, just like you are better than your grandparents. Like, you've evolved. Okay, maybe not your grandparents, but people 10,000 years ago. We have probably evolved. If you look around the room, you'll see that people have evolved for the better. They're probably nicer, they're stronger, they're taller. Like, we have this evolutionary sense of human progress, and maybe law has the same evolutionary thing. So for all that we complain about law, like, no, law should do this, our country's got this problem or that problem, like, it was probably, under this theory, it was much worse, not 10,000 years ago, but even 20 years ago or 100 years ago. And that's going to be the root of the Posner claim. So I'm going to explain his claim in a little more detail and then talk about it. Okay, there's no need to stand in the back. You can come way up all you want. The seats down here in the front are much less expensive. And just come on down and be as informal as you like. Okay, so Posner's claim was something like this. He said, look, imagine, let's just think about judges at first. Imagine that judges make laws. Like, what's their incentive to make good law, bad law? Okay, they don't want to be reversed. They want to go down in history as being famous. I mean, they have a lot of incentives, and we could talk about that in the questions and answers. But more or less, law evolves in the sense that judges make law, they rule on cases, they know the cases will be followed by other courts, and it's efficient, it's likely to be efficient, he claims, in the sense that, let's say sometimes they have a choice between two legal rules, and they go with a legal rule that's not so good. It's going to make the country poorer rather than richer. So they've sided with the wrong side. Then the claim is that over time, people won't like that rule. They'll see that they are worse off, and they'll bring more and more litigation. They'll go back to that court or other courts. They'll litigate. Judges will get exhausted, or they'll finally see that the rule is not working. Societies become poorer around them, maybe. And then slowly but surely, because of a lot of pushing from litigants, the rule will change until it becomes a more stable rule that people seem to like the rule. Maybe there are other people who are losers, but they won't have as much power because by definition, the losers lost more than the previous losers. If you lose a lot of money or a lot of, social capital or whatever it is, you'll complain. You could also complain by going to the legislature. If you've lost a lot, if, say, judges destroy property rights, or judges say, it's okay to steal. Stealing's now okay. Well, then people who have their houses robbed all the time will put up fences and they'll guard their houses, they'll hire people. It's very, very expensive to live in a society where theft is okay, for example, or where property rights are not respected. And so over time, there'll be pressure on judges to try to encourage law or the government to diminish theft or to restore property rights or whatever. And over time, you'll get stronger property rights. You'll get rules against theft. You'll get better and better rules in contracts, even in environmental law, which we'll talk about in a minute, and in other things. So his claim was that because of the pressure of courts, that is people litigating some things and not other things, there'll be pressure for law to improve over time. Now, originally, Posner contrasted this with civil law systems. Let's pick on France, since for some reason, my mother was Belgian, but for some reason, my family grew up like hating the French. Sort of, I mean, not really. But you know, like, oh, that's everything we don't want to be. Well, you could think about French law, a famous civil law system. It actually is not so different from our kind of system, from a common law system. But let's make believe it's different. And it sort of means that while in our system, judges make a lot of law, though except for constitutional problems, they can be reversed by the legislature. In the French-style system, Japanese system, in many style systems, the law comes more from the legislature. The courts are more explicitly there to interpret and apply the civil law, that is the law the legislature makes. Ideally, they don't have to do much interpretation, unlike, say, our constitutional law, because the law is supposed to be very specific. It's supposed to respond to all these circumstances. Again, in reality, none of this takes shape. You can learn about this in a comparative law class. But let's make believe that over there are some systems that are French-like, that are made by legislatures, they're elected and all that. And in other systems, they're much more judge-made, although again, they can be overruled by legislatures. And so Posner's claim was, well, judges are not beholden to interest groups as much as legislatures. And besides, they can respond very quickly. So he predicted that the common law system would probably be more responsive to change than the civil law system. No, I don't think he put a lot of stock in it. The major claim was that over time, law will improve, will move with society and improve. If it gets it wrong, again, it'll change because of litigation. Though he says, oh, it's fine. If you live in France, you can also change it by going to the legislature. And, it's not obvious which one will happen more quickly, but there grew a whole industry of academics who thought of the common law system as competing with the civil law system. And again, I'm going to talk about that in a minute, like which is better, which evolves better, in which system would you rather grow up and all that. And, is one better than the other? Does one lead to more national wealth than the other? These are things that people have tried to measure unsuccessfully, as I'll explain in a couple minutes. The part that interests me more is the overall effect, not common law versus civil law. Like everything doesn't have to be a competition. There's not a, every 4 years we don't compete, with the French to see who's got better law. But rather over time, I think the more interesting claim is that over time law improves, law evolves in a way that's good for society. Okay, if you're an optimist, you think, well, of course it does. We're much better off now than we were 100 years ago. If you're a pessimist, meaning a law student, then you think the opposite. No, law is horrible. Look at the environment. Look at crime. Look at police. Look at this. Look at that. No, it's terrible. Look at exam period. No, law has just gotten worse over time. Look at our grading system. How could that be efficient? No, it's gotten worse over time. And you're imagining, there was some perfect day back then. Either law is random and it's just as bad as it was once upon a time, or it's actually gotten worse over time, maybe because of interest groups, maybe because of bad politicians or bad judges or bad university presidents or whatever it is. But again, Posner's argument is, no, that's thinking about it the wrong way. The evolution is positive and it happens very, very quickly. Okay. There are examples we have that are neither, and I just want to mention those. They're very familiar to those of you who are first-year students in torts. But there are other examples, many, many examples, and I just want to point that out as part of the argument, because Posner was also very big in this area of law. There are some areas of law where we don't think there are superior and inferior rules. It's not like we have a rule, A, and then people come along, judges come along through litigation, and they say, kind of thinking A is not such a good rule. B is better than A. So let's move the rule to B. And again, if they make a mistake, they'll be pushed back to A or pushed to C or whatever. But maybe the move from A to B is a good move, and that's what we mean by evolution of legal rules. Now that move from A to B is very, very interesting, and I'm going to finish my talk by going back to that with a kind of interesting, quirky, almost game theory thing, but let's push that aside for a minute. So A means old law, B means a change to the new law. There probably should be catchy phrases, but I'm not good at those, so let's just call it A moving to B. All right. But there are some areas of law, as most of you know, where, the first rule and the second rule were probably indifferent. There are a lot of areas of law like that. For example, driving on the left side of the road, driving on the right side of the road. There's really no reason to think that one is better than the other. It would be very bad to have a rule that said, you can drive on either side of the road you want, even within our jurisdiction, because people would be crashing all the time and all that. So we understand that if you're in a system with roads, it's convenient to have a rule that you either drive on the left or you drive on the right. Everybody does the same thing. Then they know where to look when they get to street corners and all that kind of thing. It doesn't really surprise us that some countries drive on the left and some drive on the right. It's kind of random. By the way, over time, even there might be convergence, because it might be that autos are made, and right now the major car manufacturers make cars with the steering wheel on the left, and some of them often make cars with steering wheel on the right. You could figure out why, like here we drive on the right, so the steering wheel is on the left, so that you're closer to the fast traffic, you can see the lane and all that. In England, it's the other way around, blah, blah, blah. Like, okay, we got that idea. If law did converge, if suddenly every country said, starting in 10 years, we're all going to drive on the left, I think we would understand it. We would say, well, that's to save money in the manufacturing of cars. Why not make all the cars the same? We would have some explanation for convergence, but I think we'd find it very hard to predict whether we would converge to drive on the left or drive on the right or whatever. It's interesting, by the way, that in many countries, I don't know why I feel compelled to say this, but it's interesting that in many countries that drive on the left, it's interesting that when they walk, like when you go to the subway system, they walk on the right. That's very common. That is a little bit of a puzzle in human behavior. Like, is there something natural about walking on the right rather than the left? You might think that the left was more natural because in most languages we go from left to right. So there's a lot of, believe it or not, there are like people get PhDs in this kind of stuff. Okay, in my opinion, that's why you and I went to law school. Like, who wants to spend their lives on that kind of junk? But okay, fine. They'll have their, results. No one's taking their courses anymore, and they're getting their punishment. Okay. So we have this convergence, but there are some rules where we know we need a rule. Torts, famously, there's strict liability and there's negligence, to take the most famous example. It happens that Posner himself really liked a negligence rule. But as most of you, if not all of you, have learned, it's very hard to know whether you'd prefer to have negligence or strict liability. Probably the rule just doesn't matter. You pick one rule and people will behave the same way. Maybe in the long run there'll be more of a certain kind of thing. There'll be some activity level effect, but maybe not. Cars, probably not. You don't know in advance whether you'll be the car that runs into me or you'll be the car that I run into. You don't even know which way you want the rule to go in your own life. So famously, but we're not going to go over here, a strict liability rule and a negligence rule probably lead to the same behavior. Not probably, almost surely lead to the same behavior, except in some situations. So there are some situations where every jurisdiction has a strict liability rule. There are some situations where every jurisdiction has a negligence rule. But there are also jurisdictions where some have a strict liability rule, some have a negligence rule, and they both seem to function just fine. So that's an example where law does not converge or evolve. It's not like one rule is better and that over time you move from one rule to the other, but rather it's like driving on the right, driving on the left. Like, both rules will do so long as there's a rule. It's fine. In the case of negligent strict liability, there could even be a third rule, like when you're negligent, you pay. When you're not negligent, you pay 0.43 of the losses. That would also be just fine. It's probably a little bit complicated if you're going to go to the effort of calculating damages, why then also multiply by 0.43. Most people who go to law school can't multiply by 0.43, so maybe that's why we don't have that rule. But there's an area where the rules don't matter or the rules are equivalent, again, like driving, like negligent strict liability. And the prediction there of the literature is that all that'll happen is there'll be some evolution to a rule of either negligence, strict liability, or somewhere in between, leaving aside special cases where we might need treble damages or something like that. And that, within that area, the rule really won't matter. We should find some divergence rather than convergence. That's the convergence-divergence approach to legal rules of thinking about comparative law. Again, just to repeat, the evolutionary approach says We won't go to a bizarre rule. We'll go to a rule that really works, that makes society better off. Let's call it, in Posner fashion, makes GDP higher, though there's much more to it than that. And makes people waste less and live better lives or whatever. But that's not a claim that every system will have the same rule. Again, strict liability negligence, driving on the right, driving on the left. Because there could easily be cases where law converges on a pretty good rule, but there's more than one pretty good rule, and some systems will do one, some systems will do the other. So again, convergence towards pretty good rules over time, or divergence to pretty good rules over time, but it's a positive view of the evolution of law. Now, I got to tell you right away, there are areas where this just does not seem to happen. So take tax law, for example. So every economist seems to think that there are some ways for tax systems to be efficient. Let's assume that you want to have some taxes. Assume that there are things the government really ought to do, and it's a good idea to take money from people and spend it for some public goods. And I'm assuming that. I know we have like 11 affinity groups that say that's not true. But look, let's assume that it is a good idea for the government to raise money and for the government to spend money on public parks or the military or something like that, or giving you student loans, or, oh, I thought we would just stick to efficient things. Okay. All right. The government can make small mistakes. And so, the government does these things. Well, what should the tax system look like? Well, almost everybody who studies this think, well, you want to raise taxes, but you don't want to discourage people from working. So there might be an efficient tax system. I won't go into that now, but people no longer think quite this way, but it might be something like, if only we could tax you when you graduated from law school based on your expected future income, okay, $1.3 million, that's what you owe the government. You want to pay it over many years of work, that's fine. But that way, every year you'll think, I owe the government $1.3 million, but I can keep all the money I make this year. You'll have every incentive to work hard because you won't have to pay 40% of your income to the government. So optimal tax theory, as it's called, tends to think, actually, instead of having rates that rise as you make more and more money, we should tax you a lot at the beginning based on what we expect you to earn. And then, actually, your marginal tax rate should be very close to zero in order not to take away your incentive to work. I'd feel better if there were some nods of the heads that people understood this. Okay. Well, you notice no country has that tax system. Some countries have a wealth tax, some have a consumption tax, some have some combination. We have a somewhat progressive income tax. That's very popular around the world. So there are many, many tax systems, but almost every country has some income tax, and almost every country you pay more as you make more, whereas optimal tax theory says, oh, no, if we think you can make more money, we should tax you a lot at the outset, but we should try to make it that you have an incentive. We want Bill Gates to work hard next year rather than to be retired. That would be much better for the economy, so to speak. But almost every country does it the other way around. I'm picking that example almost at random, but it's a very good example of where what seems to be the efficient legal rule is nowhere to be found. It's not that law has evolved towards a seemingly efficient rule. Rather, law has evolved towards a rule that almost everybody who studies it thinks, boy, this appeals to voters, to the person on the street. They don't understand optimal tax theory, so it seems to appeal to people's sense of morality or what's fair. But we can handle that. If we tell them, when Bill Gates graduated college, we made him owe $1 billion, but he could pay it over the course of his life, they would probably be very happy. So it's not like people require a progressive tax system. We could show them other systems where they might think, wow, rich people are really paying a lot. Even an occasional, wealth tax would really do the job. Oh, we surprise you. In 2017, we go to all the rich people, take away a lot of money from them. That would also be pretty efficient, because then in 2018, they would have an incentive to work very hard, not knowing when, if ever, we might have that kind of tax again. I'm sorry to dwell on the tax example, but it's really a good example of where everybody seems to agree that law is not particularly efficient, that evolution has not moved towards efficiency. We'll have to have some explanations for it. So I don't want to say the argument is that law is always efficient. Rather, the argument is that over time, law becomes more efficient in most areas. And the reason, again, I picked taxes, it's not like in 1915, there was an efficient tax system. They tax people coming out of law school for their lifetime earnings. No, law was probably not efficient back then, and it's still not efficient back now. It doesn't appear to be getting more efficient. It goes up and down all over the place. But in many areas of law, like tort law, law has clearly evolved towards more efficient results. Okay. Now, another, let's just say something about civil law, common law, because I want to push it away. Again, that was an important part of the original argument, like maybe the common law system was more efficient. And there was a period when economists loved this topic. So they would go try to study like a civil law system and a common law system that otherwise had many things in common. Similar weather, similar this, similar that, natural resources, and they would be in similar parts of the world. Now it's usually done in locations in Africa, which is really very interesting. They'll have two communities that are just separated by a river in the most recent big time study. And they have very, very similar variables, if you will. And then they try to study, well, all that's different between these systems seems to be the legal rule. One was like a French colony, one was an English colony. Let's see how they're doing with their different legal rules. Most of the modern studies suggest they're doing about the same. Like the civil law, common law systems really aren't very different. That's why I started like poo-pooing it in the beginning. The early studies really did not control for so many omitted variables, as we call it. But rather, we're a little bit like, oh, look how well the common law systems have done. Oh, the United States, pretty rich country. Look, it does better than France. See, the common law system is better. That's not very good system. There are other reasons why the United States does better than France economically. Like, for one thing, we go to work. We don't have we don't have 90 days of vacation every year. And it's not the civil law that's imposed 90 days of vacation. It's like people's heritage or something or whatever. So there are, it's very hard to control for all these omitted variables. But I think the best literature now seems to show, common law, civil law, like that's not really explaining very much. It's not like law is efficient in that way. Again, that wasn't really Posner's claim. His claim just was that in either system, over time, law would move towards more efficient results. Now, a better criticism of the whole evolutionary theory, I think, is, well, wait a minute. Look around the world, look around our country, like there are so many things where law is just a mess. It's horrible. Like, look at environmental law, like over time. Like, look at the messed up environment. Like, where's law there? Like, why do we have all these climate change problems? We could have prevented all that over time, or most of that over time. Or look at crime. Like, there's a lot of crime going on in the world in both common law and civil law systems, I might add. So if the legal system was really doing a good job, you would expect law to improve it. Well, first of all, actually, there is much less crime than there was a long time ago. I don't know that law gets all the credit, but it's possible that that's a good example for Posner rather than against Posner. But it's easy for us to look around and look at the failures in law. Voting systems are another example. Actually, voting systems are a lot like driving on the right, driving on the left. There are many different kinds of voting systems. I hear there's a public choice course that you can take about this. And actually, it's not obvious which voting system is better than which. So maybe that's again an example of where there is not evolution, but that's because we're not really sure that one system is better than the other. There are like 100 different voting systems, and none of them can really be perfect for a variety of famous reasons. So maybe, again, that's not an area we should expect evolution. We might expect some voting systems never to exist. It might be like driving on the right, driving on the left, but it's probably not a good example of where we can show that law has evolved well. Crime, I think, is a closer call. Again, there's some things we just don't know. It would be really hard to know. We know we don't want people to break into houses and rob them, but we have no idea whether prisons are really the right way to fight that. We have no idea whether a 4-year prison term is better or worse than a 5-year prison term. Like, we just don't really know what evolution towards a better legal system would be. So again, you got to move that aside. Environment, that's probably an area where law has evolved pretty well, though probably not because people have run to judges and said, oh, we need to improve tort law this way, that way. Probably just because governments in general have seen a growing problem and have started regulating against negative externalities or whatever. So yeah, maybe that's a good Posner example of positive evolution, but not nearly as good as contract law, tort law, and some other areas where the positive evolution is much more obvious. In any event, I don't think anybody would say, no matter how much you worry about climate change, I don't think anybody would say, oh, there's been anti-evolutionary progress. I don't think people would think law is now worse than it was 25 years ago. They might say, well, 25 years ago, I wish we had had a different legal system with respect to climate, But Posner seems to be right, even with respect to things like climate change and law. I'll give you another kind of example where I think maybe it's wrong. How about like discrimination in the workplace? I think that's a very interesting example. So you'd think that in an evolutionary system, that in a Posner kind of system, you'd think that there'd be law would move so that discrimination in the workplace would be non-existent by now. And we know that's not true. Now, again, Posner person might say, well, there's probably less discrimination than there was in the past. Law has a lot to do with it. It's made most kinds of discrimination illegal. It's making more kinds of discrimination illegal, every decade. It's done this through private law actions, through public law actions. Like, oh, that's a triumph of law. I don't know, if you've been discriminated against in the workplace or watched it, it's not so obvious that it's such a magnificent set of evolutionary principles. Like, there still seems to be a lot of obvious discrimination. So maybe that's a lack of success of the evolutionary argument. Now, economists like to say, just a little economics here, economists, at least when I was in graduate school, a famous economic claim that came from the other side of the Midway, I might add, famous economic claim was, well, the reason that discrimination is inefficient, like you could run a better workplace if you weren't discriminating, because there are a lot of good workers out there that you're discriminating against, you're not hiring. But the economist's argument was, well, maybe the people who run these companies have a taste for discrimination. They just have personal taste that they like certain kinds of people, they don't like other kinds of people, or they think the world should look a certain way, and that one way they exercise their wealth is by discriminating. Now, if you're going to look horrified, just look into your own life. Most of you have a taste in dating. Like, very few people sitting here want to date somebody who's 83 years old. So, laughing doubles your sin. So, that's age discrimination on your part. Like, get used to it. Like, most of us discriminate on the basis of things that if companies did it, we would say it was illegal and we would have law stop it. So almost all of us do have a taste for discrimination. Some of it's about religion, some of it might be about race still, though much less than in the past. Some of it might be about ethnic origin. A lot of it is about age. When we're your age in dating, that's most obvious. So that's kind of the economist's view, like, okay, get used to it. People have a taste that we might call discrimination. If firms do it, but we all do it, oh, economists would say, that'll dissipate over time because if you have a firm that, say, discriminates against women, well, then other firms will move into the marketplace and they will compete with those firms. They'll hire talented women who aren't getting jobs elsewhere. They'll be able to hire them at lower wages. The firms will be profitable. Uh-oh, wait a minute. They're not allowed to hire people at lower wages. So maybe law's getting in the way there. Posner would have to challenge that. Well, maybe in the short run they could discriminate. Maybe that's why women earn lower wages now. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on there. But anyway, it doesn't really seem to work very well. Like, over time, there remains a lot of discrimination in the workplace, not to mention in dating. Not meant to be funny. And, or in shopping. People might shop, from people that they know through church, or that they people of a racial group they identify with or whatever. So there's lots and lots of discrimination going on. Just law aims at certain kinds of defendants and so forth. So that might be an example. Again, though, I don't think that this shows the failure of legal evolution because it was probably worse 50 years ago. It just shows that the evolutionary argument, is limited in its scope. If it works in certain areas and not very much in other areas. Although maybe discrimination is a good example of where it will work. It might be that if we meet again at your 25th reunion, since most of you in this room are law students, it might be that if we meet at your 25th reunion, we'll say, wow, really proud to be a lawyer. Look how discrimination in the workplace has basically disappeared. And then you might say, oh, my children are dating 80-year-olds. It's even working there. Like, wow, this anti-discrimination law really is a good thing. I feel sorry for you when your daughter-in-law or son-in-law is 3 times your age. I mean, that'll be unfortunate for you probably. But you can imagine a world like that where anti-discrimination law really spreads around, and then Posner types will come and say, wow, look how efficient law was. It moved towards total anti-discrimination and all that. All right. Here's another aspect. I'm going to leave climate change out of it, I think. I'll just say one or two words about climate change. But I think we should set it aside. That is, it is one of the most important issues of our time, but I think we should set it aside for the following reason. We are all like civil law countries in that respect. Like, I don't think any single judge has the nerve to say, oh, climate change, big problem. I know when the next tort case comes in here, I know what to do to really better our climate change situation, and then other judges will have to follow me. I know the right answer. Like, I think judges are, as power hungry as some of them might be, I don't think they have the solution to climate change. I mean, I don't think we do either. Like, it's very complicated about what we should do, and it's easy to run for president and say it's a high priority, but as we see, even our president, it's just probably better to say it's a problem than it's not a problem, but it's not obvious what to do. You could raise a lot of money, but you're not really sure how to spend it, and should it be spent now? Should it be spent when new technology develops? Like, this is a very, very serious problem. Way too serious for any one judge or any set of judges to think, I see exactly what to do. I'm going to use tort law to solve climate change. So I think there are areas like that where there's not a very good evolutionary story about law, not because the original Chicago best idea was wrong, but rather because judges were a little bit, they had some humility. They're not sure they know what to do. So what they don't want to do is mess things up. They say they want to leave it to the legislature. Really, they probably think the legislature isn't that talented either, but they don't want to be blamed for getting it wrong, so they stay out of it. And that might be true of a lot of very, very important things. They're not really sure what to do, so they don't do anything. Again, that's not either positive evolution or negative evolution. It's like a random evolution. They're not sure what to do, or no evolution, or they keep to the prior rule, a subject I'm about to get to in a minute. It might be the right way to do that is to copy what other countries do. That might be another evolutionary process. That's not a bad idea, by the way. Another good evolutionary story, not mentioned by Posner, would be, why spend a lot of money trying to figure out how to make law better? Just copy a successful country. I'm just going to throw this out as an idea in case you're looking for a paper topic. For example, I don't know, there are really many examples. I'll just pick healthcare because it's a recent favorite of mine. So law is unimpressive there. Mostly it's statutory law. But our country spends an enormous amount of money, more money per capita on healthcare, and we do not have better outcomes. We have worse outcomes. We don't live as long as many other countries. And even though Italy and the Netherlands are very good examples, they spend significantly less money than we do per capita, and yet they live longer. Netherlands is really, I just came from the Netherlands, it's a really interesting example. I mean, they do a lot of things better than we do. They probably have better art than we do. They certainly are taller than we are, as if like height is a good thing. I don't want to discriminate or anything like that. But most people think that height is a good measure of health and other things. But their longevity is really quite interesting. And a lot of it is very similar. I mean, the women live longer than the men, just as they do in the United States, as in almost every country in the world, by the way. And we don't quite understand that either. In the old days, they said, oh, those men have dangerous jobs. They're in the field, they're in the factories. That's not true anymore. And yet, women outlive men by about the same 3 years or so in almost every country. So a lot of things we don't understand. The Dutch don't understand it either. But they're living longer and yet spending less money on healthcare. So one possibility for changing law over time would be just to give up. Like our legislature and our judges could say, we don't seem to be evolving in a way that's very successful. We're no longer living longer than we were. So you know what? Let's just do what the Dutch do. Whatever law they do, we'll copy that. When they change the law, we'll change the law. That might be what some states do with respect to other states. That would be another method of evolution, that it's not that people are litigating, it's rather that some countries or states learn, well, if there are things that we're not getting better at, let's just copy countries that are doing it better. That's kind of interesting approach. It doesn't seem to work very well in the United States because we have this like America thing where we're like, don't want to copy other countries. Like if somebody ran for president and said, we're going to do exactly what the Dutch do, the person wouldn't even live long enough to run for office. Like it would be terrible. No. You have to say we're exceptional and we're this and come up with excuses for everything. It's probably a bad idea. Again, there are a lot of omitted variables, but they're not. I know what you're thinking and you're wrong. It's not that we have poorer people and they have worse health care. First of all, other countries have that too. Second of all, even our wealthiest people don't live as long as the wealthiest people in 7 other countries. So, you know, even though they have lots of money, lots of access to healthcare, like all the explanations we grew up believing, oh, no, yeah, really, no, they're just not true. We just are worse at it. Like, get used to it. We're worse at it. And there are some things we're worse at. Most things we do very well at. Some things that law has a lot to say about, we just do very, very badly about. And so maybe copying would be a good form of evolution if you had faith that we would copy the right things. Okay, I promised to go back to legal change and a little bit of a mystery, and I love this topic, so I wanted to say something about that before trying to engage you with questions. So here, let's call this evolving law, which is a play on evolutionary law, but you'll see what I mean in a minute. So imagine that you have a judge. It could be also a member of the legislature, or it really could be a person in everyday life. This is going to apply to a lot of things where our behavior is capable of change. So to make this example easy, imagine the judge or the legislator, I'm not sure which one to pick. Let's say the lawmaker, I'll just say. The lawmaker, let's say, has 2 choices. I'll go back to my original thing of A and B. So A is the existing legal rule, and there is the alternative that you could stick with A or you could switch to B. Okay, I'm going to explain what's called the switching paradox and then an argument against it. That's where I'm going. So if you remember something from this lecture and you want to talk about it, dinner with people, or you know, when you see your family again at Thanksgiving or something, just remember switching paradox. It's like a good topic. Okay, so it goes something like this. The rule is A, or the practice is A, and now you have an idea. Maybe B would be better than A. So you study it. You do the best you can. You try to study outcomes. You hire, you know, Adam Chilton to do some, you know, mathematical thing about it. You make believe you understand what he's doing, and you get the result. And then you decide, oh, there's a 60% chance that B is better than A. And you go by the stats, and you think, yeah, I want to switch from A to B. You're not sure. I mean, we're never sure, but you're, you know, more than 50% sure that B is better than A. So you're all ready to switch. Switch your behavior, switch the legal rules, switch what side of the road you drive on, switch whatever you're thinking of. Switch how long prison sentences are. You know, whatever you want to think about, there's this possibility of switching. Okay. Then somebody comes to you and says, wait a minute. I want to show you why conservatism really makes sense. Conservative here with a very small c. I'll look at it this way. There are a lot of smart people before you, and they also studied the choice between A and B. Again, we got to set aside cases where the world of the technology has changed so much that now B is better than A for reasons they didn't know about 30 years ago. But that's why I made it 60%. It's not like 90%. You know, it's like, you know, it's a close call, but I'm pretty sure B is better than A. Okay. So those smart people before you, they also thought about A against B, and they decided A was better. After all, we inherited the rule of A. So it must be, they say to you, you know, don't discount smart people in the past. And we had, let's say, 4 generations before you who had the choice between A and B, and they chose A. A and B, A. A and B, A. A and B, A. You know, now you, like one person, come along and you say A and B, B. 0.6, B. And now you should realize, you know, you're probably wrong. Like there's a wisdom of crowds. And these 4 people who went before you preferred or chose A over B with the same social goals or goals in the company or whatever it is, but let's say social goals. So really, you should really hesitate to change your behavior or change law from something that's been tried and true in the past, because the people who went before you were not idiots. Okay, everybody understand? I think that's the classic argument for conservative approach to law. Like value people who came before you, they were smart. Probably what they did, they were at least as smart as we were, or exactly as smart as we are. And if a lot of them thought A was better than B, you got to be very, very careful before you move from A to B. You should be, you know, 90% sure, 80% sure that B is better than A before switching. Okay, so everybody understands that. That means like switching seems like a bad idea. But there's an argument against that. Oh, and that would be consistent, I think, with Posner's evolutionary thing. Like, oh, when law changes, people are aware of this evolutionary thing. They hesitate to change. They're actually pretty conservative because they've thought about this logic of why you should be conservative in changing law, why you should follow precedent in our lingo, so to speak. And they thought, look, I'm only going to change when I'm really pretty sure the times have changed or I'm right, and I'm going to switch from A to B when it's like 70% likely that B is better than A. Therefore, over time, when we see law change, it's almost surely for the better because people know that they should only change when they're really pretty sure that B is better than A. All right, everybody, we got that. All right, now, a clever recent idea is, whoa, wait a minute. You're jumping too fast because maybe the people before us were smart enough to be as smart as we are now, and they also thought the same way. So, 4 generations ago, someone thought, A is better than B, and the guy before, maybe B is, I think B is better than A, he thought. 0.6 chance that B is better than A. But then he said to himself, well, I inherited this rule of A from 2 generations before me, and, they weren't stupid because Levmore and other people say the people before me were as smart as I am. So even though I think B is better than A, I should not be switching from A to B unless I'm very sure that B is better than A. I'm not very sure. I'm only 60% sure that B is better than A. So even though the people before me thought B was better than A, over time we might have 5 generations in a row of people thinking B is better than A. I shouldn't change because the people before me thought A was better than B. And you might have this recursive problem where everybody thinks they should be conservative, but over time, you see why I picked 5, because 0.6, therefore 0.4 error, and I can take 0.4 to the 5th, pretty easily. That's the limit of my in-the-head math. So I think that would be like, it's 87%. If you think it's 0.6 and everybody before you thought it was 0.6, then it's something like 0.87. You should be 87% sure that switching is actually a good idea. One more time, because you think it's 0.6 likely, now you understand that people before you might also have thought it was 0.6 likely, but they also thought that they should abide by precedent. And so therefore, even if you're only 0.6 likely to think you should change, you should probably really change because your 0.6 is really 0.87. That's kind of cool, I think. Again, there are a lot of assumptions there that that people before you will. Okay, where does that leave me? Well, it leaves me to think, this is why we run our law school the way we do. And by that I mean that whenever you think about changing a legal rule, whenever you think about the evolution of law, you really need to know whether the people before you were about as right as you were or also suffered from this evolutionary paradox, this switching paradox. So really you need to examine, well, what's the best case for the rule they had? Like, let's not just see their rule and then either change it or change it if we think we're 0.8 likely to be right to change it. Let's try to understand why they had their rule. Now, we can't really go by what they say because what are they going to say? I think this is the wrong rule, but the guy before me had the rule. Maybe he had the rule. They're not going to say that. So don't pay too much attention to what they say, but try to think of the best argument that could have been made on their behalf or the behalf of generations before. So think about reasons for legal rules and then think about how sure you are that the reason for the legal rule is wrong. I think that's what legal education here is, right? We look at prior rules and we respect them, but we also try to understand what's the reason for those rules, what's the best possible argument for the rule we have. If the best possible argument's pretty good, then precedent makes a lot of sense. If the best possible argument for the legal rule is shaky, and we have a much better argument for changing the rule, then we like to argue for changing the rule from A to B. So I feel like that's the real evolutionary story of law. The real evolutionary story of law is you. It's in your hands. I know it's a little corny what I'm about to say, but I actually believe it, so I'm going to say it. And it's something like, if you educate people to think about what's the best argument for the preceding legal rule, and then what's the best argument you can make for changing the rule, and you put people like that in charge of making legal rules, either by being good lawyers or by being judges or being in the legislature and all that, and they're really thinking about the switching paradox the right way, then when they want to change the rule, they've probably got it right, because they've thought carefully about this incentive on both sides. They've thought carefully about the reason for legal rules, the reason for changing legal rules. So in an ironic or maybe lovely way, I think Posner's right, though perhaps for a different reason. The evolution is likely to be for a very good reason, but the very good reason is that there are thoughtful people thinking about the prior arguments for rules, the rules for change, why change might be good, and so forth. So I think the evolution of law is likely to be positive, as Posner says, in areas where they don't fit some of the exceptions I said, but because we have to count on thoughtful people to do the change. That's my take on Posner's evolution of law. Now it's your turn to ask questions. So the question is, oh, wait a minute, what about malicious actors? Like there might be bad people in this string of things who are not trying to make the world a better place. What are we going to do? I think it takes into account malicious actors because it says, I don't have a theory about why there should be more evil people now than there were 100 years ago. So as long as the distribution of evil people is random or something like that, like there's no reason to think that they're biasing the system more one way or the other way today than in the past. It's easier to change law from A to B when you can see that A got there because of maliciousness, if that's the right word. And similarly, our people who follow us will know to change rules that are put into effect by malicious people. Now, the malicious people can't stay in effect forever. Maybe they could change constitutional rules or international rules or something that's very hard to change. But it's very, very hard. I mean, if you're, this is again an interesting public choice topic, say you're the leader of the country and you're a very bad person. All you want to do is make yourself better off. It's very hard. I mean, almost anything you do can be undone by the next legislature or the next thing. I mean, it's a very interesting topic. You know, you raise taxes on the wrong people, they can give money back, spend money for those people, or lower tax on those people in the future. You do this, they can undo that. You know, really, almost everything Congress does, for example, can be undone. There are some exceptions. For example, I'll give you some advice on being an evil leader. For example, you could build a bridge in the wrong place, like serving your friends, and you could put your name on the bridge. And it's probably unlikely that the next generation will find it worth, it's a terrible bridge. I mean, it's got your name on it, which is kind of uncool in the first place. And second of all, it should have been built 20 miles downstream. You know, you put it in the wrong place to serve society well. But once the bridge is there, it's probably not sensible to take down the bridge. It would only be sensible to send a message to other evil people. Don't think you can be forever by building bridges in the wrong place. So there are ways for evil people to try to cement their hold by doing wrongful things that are very hard to undo. But those are rare. See, I had to work hard to come up with that example. Most things that they do are easily undone, as we see in this administration. It's actually pretty easy to undo a lot of past things. Now, I don't mean it's perfectly undone. Like there will be people who suffer, they'll be in prison, or they'll have lost their money, or they'll be withheld at the border. I mean, it's obviously can't be undone for every individual. But in terms of whatever the goal was of the person who put the law into effect, you know, they weren't really thinking about that individual who's worse off or better off. They were thinking about their selfish or global view. Almost whatever they do can be undone. So I don't think it really matters. I think as long as the distribution of evilness is, you know, random, everything's okay. Yeah. Okay, so the question is, maybe you overstated what I meant to say, but I'll blame myself for that. The question is, it sounds like you, the speaker, are saying that we can measure whether the law is doing a good job or a bad job by looking at, say, the wealth in society or the length of life or the tallness of people, though I certainly didn't say that was because of law. But gee, how do you know that? There's so many confounding variables. It might be that the weather was better, so crop production went up. It might be that there was a good patent that somebody came, oh, well, that's law, be careful. So there might be some things that come about not because of law, so why am I attributing everything to law? All right, well, it's a very, very good question. Not that the first question was not very, very good. But it's a very, very good question. So I'll just say something boring like this. Well, first of all, of course there are confounding factors, but we tend to think that at a large scale, law must matter some. Just like on a large scale, we tend to think that evil people matter some. So for example, the failure of the Soviet Union and the relative success of the West, I think is really uncontrovertible. Like everybody agrees, oh, that system didn't do very well. Now, why did it not do well? It might have been a few evil leaders. It might have been bad weather. It might have been, you know, the legal system. Like we tend to think a lot of it has to do with law. Like they should have had a little bit more free enterprise. Look how the farms did so much better when they let the workers keep a lot of what they made. We tend to think, oh, law had a really, really big effect. Oh, it can't be that it was only law. I mean, there are probably little accidents that happened on the way, maybe the weather, maybe the leaders, although that would require you to think that the leaders in the United States and in England were particularly good at that time, and very few people like to say that. So it is kind of long run. If, for example, there are 11 communist countries and 9 out of 11 of them do badly, and there are 9 out of 11, capitalist, American or British, style countries that do very well, and those all do very well, and those all do very badly. Like after a while, you can get rid of a lot of the omitted variables, just the way we can decide that a medicine is good for you, even though there are a million confounding variables. A lot of the medicines you and I take work for both of us, or don't work for both of us, even though there are a lot of confounding variables. There's what sex we are, how tall we are, what age we are, what this we are. It's easy to complain and say, oh, you should have done a test on young boys between 8 and 11 years old. How do you know? Well, you can't divide everybody into a million groups. Everybody's different, because then you don't have enough data. So by and large, we tend to think that if you can control for a lot of omitted variables, and it still seems to hold, that we've done a pretty good job. And I think that's my approach to law, and a lot of people's approach to law. Like, if law is of a certain kind in many, many countries that are doing pretty well, and law is of another kind in many, many countries that are not doing well, there are a lot of other confounding variables there, but I think I am ready to give law a lot of credit. I'll just do it closer to home. Like, I think the University of Chicago Law School is probably the best law school you could have gone to. Okay, it's my job to say that, but I really do believe that. So how would we know whether you've picked the right law school? So one possibility is we could look at the employment rate of graduates. Another possibility is we could look at the earnings rate of graduates. Another possibility is we could look at, your self-report of the value of education. Another, there are many, many ways to measure it. They are all obviously flawed, right? They all have trouble. Like, even as I say them, you can see people like, well, I don't know. But if over the long haul, schools that attract faculty members like one or two seated here, or over the long haul, they attract students like you who want to work hard and learn a lot. If over the long haul, they all took elements, you could try to think of things that are unique to the University of Chicago Law School, and if over the long haul, a lot of those people look back on law school and say, I learned a lot, or they have good careers, or they earn a lot, after years and years and years of this happening, after a while, we think, chances are pretty good that we've controlled, not perfectly, but we've controlled for all the omitted variables. It'd be really surprising if over time you said, I probably would have done just the important omitted variable was my parents. They really made me a good lawyer. Well, would you, doing it all over again, prefer to go to the Southern Hawaii Law School? There is no such law school. I'm picking that example carefully. Probably it would be irrational to go there. So I only give that example to stress in almost every decision we make in life, we can have this objection, like, how do we really know, X caused Y? And the answer is, over many observations with many omitted variables, some of which we can test for, some of which we can't test for, we tend to reach a pretty rational solution. I think in the case of law making society better off, we're better off as either wealth or happiness or something. Wow, that seems relatively easy compared to all these other problems. That's why the studies look at income, because it's easier to measure, and ex ante at least, most people say, I tend to be a grouchy person, but I'd rather have more money than less money. Like, most people are pretty happy with more money rather than less, so that's a usual measurement. And besides, no one claimed strict liability versus negligence, one of them will make you happier. No. They might say one of them will make society richer or poorer or whatever. So they tend to be measuring the things that most people think law can affect. I see. Oh, that's a complicated question. So I don't know that I have a good answer, but I'm going to fake it. So the question is something like, the world's getting more specialized, and doesn't that change the argument about something like the common law? The common law covers so many areas. Maybe within the common law, let's say, there are areas where things are improving because of the law. There are areas where things are getting worse because of the law. Like, why make this generalized statement about positive improvement? First of all, in my defense, I didn't try to make a common statement about everything. I thought I took out some areas where I thought the argument was implausible, like tax law, for example, where I said it doesn't appear to be any movement towards a more efficient tax law system. So I'm trying to take you at your word. But now I'm going to like try to rip into the question. First of all, contrary to what most people in the room think, I do not think that the world is more specialized than it was. There are obviously some areas where it's more specialized, but Henry Ford's factories were extremely specialized. Like each worker, one person did that all day, 9 hours a day, until he made it 8 hours a day, and so forth. So, that's exactly right. I'm reading a book now on the history of Henry Ford. So I'm kind of into this. It's for probably the world's worst reading group anybody could have ever joined. Okay, so, the world was very specialized then, and then people learned, workers are unmotivated. I mean, his turnover rate was very, very high. And so people learned, perfect specialization is probably not a good idea. Look at law firms. On the one hand, they want you to specialize. You should do tax law. You should learn a lot about, health companies but on the other hand, we're also happy for you to do some pro bono work over there. And could you help in this project over there? Like they don't want you to get bored. So on the one hand, your knowledge is very specialized. But on the other hand, there's a limit to how much people want to be specialized. And I think we're more aware of that now than we were in the past. Plus, the people who have the most effect on law, say the president, the Speaker of the House, the Dean of the Law School, whatever you want, Posner, you look at those people, they, by nature, have to be unspecialized because they are supervising lots and lots and lots of areas. So even though they can hire specialists, they need to make decisions about a lot of topics. So it's almost impossible to imagine really increased specialization going on without limit. Same in the Air Force, let's say. There's specialization, but then as you go up the hierarchy, the people have to, by nature, be unspecialized because they have to decide where to put resources and all that. So I'm not really sure I agree with the premise of the question, but if the premise of the question is right, or is 0.6 right, as I've been saying today, maybe it just means that we've got to be careful in our claim. We've got to look for areas like tax law where the argument is probably not true, and look for areas where we think it probably is true. It doesn't worry me. I mean, the question's better than the answer. It doesn't really worry me. So the question is, well, wait a minute. If you're going to take this evolution stuff seriously, I think you can already see my answer. But if you're going to take this evolution stuff seriously, like, why don't judges think, if I think we should move from A to B, but there are all these people ahead of me, I have evolutionary advantage over them. I've evolved. I'm like Bill Posner, old guy. Like, I'm much smarter than Posner because I've evolved. I can throw balls further. I can hunt better. I can think better. I can judge better. Well, you can already see the answer, which is legal evolution can happen in a matter of days because laws can change, people can vote, they can watch some effects of the legal system. But human evolution, depending on what's at stake, is somewhere between hundreds of years and 10,000s of years. So I don't think anyone in the evolutionary world claims that we're smarter than people who were born 100 years ago. Evolution of the brain takes a really, really long time. For example, the percentage of people that are right-handed has been about the same, ever since we've kept records like that. Now, height, for example, has changed a lot, but we think we understand that because of diet, and that's a very quick change. So people, for example, in Japan are about as tall as we are now, whereas they were much shorter, as World War II was ending, or they had a much inferior diet and so forth. So that's not exactly evolution. There are some things where the evolution is very fast, like plants. We can modify plants very, very quickly, and they can self-modify very, very quickly to survive. Unfortunately, COVID, is because evolution is very quick. The virus is really, at least as fast as our brilliant scientists are, and so forth. But our brains and our arms, our ability to take notes in class, those evolve very, very slowly. So I'm not worried, again. I think we have time for one more question. Yeah, as I repeat the question, I'll try to think of my answer to it. The question is, well, wait a minute. So there's some areas where at least you, the speaker, thinks that evolution has really, that Posner's right. The other areas like tax, doesn't sound right. So let's say it's torts, it's contracts. I didn't say contracts except in this talk, but I saw it on the poster. I think the Dean of Students added contracts in there, probably to attract an audience. And I thought, okay, it would have been funnier if the Dean of Students had been elements. Oh, it really involves, very, very, all right. Then I'd have trouble answering the question. So there are some areas that I seem to think evolution has been positive, and there are some areas where I think it's like driving on the right, driving on the left. I have not identified a single area. So I avoided talking about interest groups because it's a big topic of mine in public choice. I didn't want to burden everybody with it. I didn't bring up a single topic where I thought the evolution was negative. I think Posner really probably should have stated his argument that way. Evolutionary pressure probably means that negative evolution, harmful evolution is very unlikely. There are interest groups now, there are interest groups then, and so forth. Okay. So what is it about torts, contracts, and a few other areas where we think, why are those the areas where evolution is positive? That's the question. Well, some people would like to say it's because common law judges are more involved and the legislature is sitting there on top of them. I think the more likely Posner solution, which I like, is to say, boy, when law gets it wrong, they're immediately losers with a lot of money at stake, and they have a big incentive to lobby. That's the good side of lobbying, right? I mean, lobbying can be both good and bad. The good side is, if with your law, people like me are going to lose $1 million a day, or with your law, I'm not going to be able to go to law school, we'll lobby very fast to change the rule, and there's more money at stake, there's more human value at stake, whereas if the law is good law, the losers there probably have less at stake. That's what makes it good law. So probably the amount of effort spent in lobbying in some areas, like torts and contracts, probably suggests more of the good kind of lobbying when the law is getting it wrong. I think that's a pretty robust answer. Now, just to be difficult or make your question even better than it is, you can think of a lot of areas where that's not true. Like a lot of advertising cuts the other way. You can get in a mode where, people start competing over silly things. I think a lot of our, should go to my favorite examples, I think a lot of our competitor law schools compete over the wrong things. Like, oh, we'll admit you earlier, or we'll, have no classes on Friday. Like, those competitions might be worth a lot to some people, they might be negative to other people. There's no particular reason to think that that's efficient evolution. Might even be negative evolution, short run versus long run, and so forth. So thank you so much for coming, and hope to see you soon.